Our next panelist will be Sudha Vasan, who's an associate professor of sociology at the University of Delhi. She works on the sociology of development and political ecology, among other things. Her book is called Living with Diversity, Forestry Institutions in Western Himalaya. And she's also published on a variety of topics, such as forestry law, ideology, and practice. It's given presentations on things like democratic decision-making, environmentalism in the crisis of capitalist development.
Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure for many, many reasons, not least of all that we're going to discuss how to change the world with an audience that's, skewed in terms of gender ratios in a way that's very, very different from many places where these decisions are made. So it's a pleasure to be here and talking and having this discussion with all of you. I'm actually going to make a very simple argument to you. What I'm going to try and convince you in the 15 minutes that I have is really that the environmental challenge that we face is going to be a game changer. It's going to change the way we think of inequality, in the sense that I'm going to try and convince you that we actually cannot deal with this environmental crisis that we face without fundamentally changing the way we look at inequality. I'm going to argue that in an unequal world, we perhaps even cannot perceive the full extent of the environmental challenge. Okay? It's a simple argument, but a lot to do perhaps in 15 minutes, but hopefully it'll be a discussion that will continue and set you thinking on these lines. One of the things that I think about when I think of the environmental challenge is, in some sense, the kind of responses that we have so far in the major decision-making places of the world. When the panel on the environment was announced and Catherine sort of mentioned it, there were many hoots out here, and the fact that this is perhaps an audience that recognizes the importance of this problem. And yet, if you look at the kind of global solutions that we've had so far to this challenge that we face, there are three. You can broadly look at them at three types of solutions. One, of course, is the simple ostrich effect, the assumption that it's not yet that critical, that it's actually possible to deny the crisis that we are facing. The second, of course, is assuming and attempting to isolate the problem. In fact, Ed's paper actually brings us to that kind of, from where probably those kinds of assumptions come. The fact that the crisis is most acutely felt by the poorest and the most vulnerable sections of people in terms of economic development too. And the third kind of solution that I'm going to talk about is the fact that we tend to have solutions that tend to isolate the benefits and costs of development. In some sense, there's an idea that the costs of development can, in fact, be transferred to certain other sections of people. So hopefully I'll have enough time to go through each of these. But let me begin with the differential appreciation of the problem itself. I do believe that in a world that is unequal in all the different ways that we've seen since the morning session, it's in fact not really possible to appreciate the environmental crisis in the same kind of way. I'll pick three examples today. There are many, many other ways in which you can think of it. The first of all is simply asking the question, will the kind of environmental changes that we're seeing in the world today affect all sections of people equally? And if you look at it in the short or the medium term, the answer is clearly no. The kind of land use changes that you saw in the last presentation, clearly it's the poorest sections of the people who are also facing the worst impacts of the changes in the climate or in changes in loss of biodiversity as we speak today. There is, of course, an understanding that in the long term, in the last instance, it's a planet-level crisis, and we will all sink or swim together. There really isn't, a section of the world, a section of humanity that would escape that, end. But what we see in the short and the long term is that short and the medium term, the interim period, is really that it is possible to look at this as affecting some sections of the world, some sections of humanity more than others. And there's enough evidence of that. I won't go into it since the last presentation did precisely that. The paper is available, and you can look at other sort of examples of that. So in some sense, if you look at decisions that are being made in the short or medium term, they're also not necessarily looking at this as an immediate crisis. There's a difference in the perception of how urgent this crisis is, how soon we need to deal with it. There is at least one school of thought that does imagine that there is a lot of time before which we will come up with technologies or other kinds of ways in which it is possible to deal with the environmental crisis. The second kind of difference in the way in which the problem itself is perceived is really connected to expectations of the future. This is another kind of way in which we're going to talk about exactly the opposite of what happens with the previous perception of the problem. If you look at expectations of the future, they're often based on what people already have today. And if you're looking at it in terms of the most quoted definition of sustainable development that we have in terms of thinking of future generations and their needs, considering what we have today, there is, in some sense, a need to deal with intragenerational equity before we start thinking of intergenerational equity. And this is seen most acutely in places where the most vulnerable sections of the population live. I'm not just talking about countries and the kind of differences we find between them, but I do believe that inequality needs to be looked at very different scales. One, of course, the global scales, where we look at data at the level of countries and how developing and developed countries are doing, but often within these countries, too, there are tremendous amounts of inequalities in terms of region, in terms of caste, if you take a place like India, in terms of race, in terms of gender. And in some sense, the problem itself becomes a Gordian knot precisely because of this. Because when we're making global decisions, we're often taking probably the broadest scale that's possible, and that doesn't necessarily translate to the same kind of impacts at the local level. For instance, if we look at the most local of impacts, something like the fuel crisis in the Himalayan region, something that I work on most closely, one of the things that's happening if you look at the Himalayan region in India itself, the development indicators are actually getting better. What you find is actually that there are more jobs there, the income levels are going up, and what you are finding is also that fuel consumption is actually going down. What you're finding is that local people are increasingly using less and less of the forests that they're living next to. That, in fact, at one level, at the macro scale, is a very good indicator. And in fact, India does talk about the fact that, in terms of land use change, the forest cover is actually not going down in a place like India, and particularly not in the Himalayan regions of India. But what is interesting, if you actually do a micro-level study and go into looking at what kind of fuel consumption is actually there and what is happening, one of the things that I'm finding in the kind of survey that I'm doing over a 20-year period is actually the kind of energy use in that region per capita is actually going up. People are actually consuming more energy than they were 20 years ago. What we're saying is, though, that the local forests are being protected, and they are. You can see, the forests in the region that I'm working at, a state called Himachal Pradesh. It is actually much greener. There isn't as much degradation as we used to see 15, 20 years ago. But one of the things that we're finding is that, along with development, one of the things that's happening is that people are using resources from further and further away. Okay? I'm giving you a very micro example. But we can take it up further and further to different scales. And one of the propositions that I want to make to you that it's not enough to simply look at development and environment as two kind of black boxes, but look at the dynamic changes that are happening. If you look at simply energy consumption, but you can look broader at resource consumption, one of the things that's happening with increased income levels and increased development in the way we have mainstream indicators for it is simply that the developed sections of humanity are consuming resources that are further and further away from them. So what we are conserving is often the resources that are most close to us, and what we are degrading is, in fact, things from other parts of the world. I think it's a significant argument for not looking at these as, differences between countries, because when you talk about a country that is becoming, is consuming less and less of its natural resources, I think it's important to also look at flows in and flows out, because the more developed the region you are, the more developed a section of population you are, what we're actually doing is consuming other people's resources. So given that this is possible in an unequal world, our perception of the environmental crisis is going to be fundamentally different. Because as we get more and more developed, what we see around us is that it's not an immediate crisis. In fact, it's the poorest sections who see the environmental crisis more critically as being much more immediate. This differential perception is important, because I'll come to the decision-making structures that we have. And so when I come to that, the importance of a difference like this will become even more clearer. I want to give you one more example in which to convince you how the perception of the environmental crisis is different. If you look at social movements around the world, there are several places now where there are significant struggles going on which can be broadly called environmental activism or environmental struggles. Yeah. They are about protecting forests, they are about protecting rivers, they are about protecting waters. In fact, I'm a social anthropologist, so I work much more at the local level, and I look at social movements like this. I think one of the major things that we need to note is that the way a problem is defined is very, very different in an unequal world. If you look at the way we talk about it in decision-making bodies, if you look at the way we talk about it in fact, the developed world, I would like to say, but I would also like to say, the developed sections of the population in a place like India, we talk about it as an environmental crisis. We talk about it as an effort, in some sense, to protect and conserve and save the environment, where the environment does emerge as an abstract concept. But if you look at the ground-level social movements around issues to protect the forests, what you find is that these are actually defining the problem as a livelihood crisis, something that affects their income, their everyday life, their vulnerability, the risk that they face, rather than as something that is an abstract environmental concept. I'll give you one example. I don't know how familiar you are with the Chipko movement, and a movement that has been sort of become popular around the world as an environmental movement. It's interesting because in a lot of the discourse and a lot of writing around something like the Chipko movement, it is sort of seen as one of the preeminent environmental movements in the developing part of the world. The Chipko movement, for those of you who are not familiar, is really a movement in the Himalayan region where local women, rural women, in some sense, hugged trees. The term Chipko comes from the fact that women of that region felt that these trees should not be harvested. So when the contractors were coming to cut down these trees, the women of that village actually went there and hugged the trees and said, well, you can't cut these trees without harming us. So of course, it became this icon of a gender issue too, so sensitiveness to the environmental issue, and the fact that it's an environmental movement. And it is. I don't mean to take away from the fact that the rural women in Uttarakhand, in the Himalayan region of India, were actually protecting those trees. There is no taking that away. But if you look at what has happened, this is in the late 80s that I'm talking about. If you want to look at what happens in the same region today, since Chipko has been built as an environmental movement and has actually got this international attention, one of the things we have in the region is the fact that there is a lot of state attention to the region itself. There's a lot of attention from environmental organizations, and people have actually come in with legislations that prevent the cutting of trees in that region totally. There's a blanket ban on harvesting trees in that region. That, in fact, has been exactly the opposite of what those women were asking. Because, yes, those women were asking to protect those trees. But what they were fundamentally asking, if you listen to their language and the way they phrased it, they were actually asking that the contractors and the government not decide what happens to the trees. They were seeing it as a livelihood issue, as an issue of who has the right to decide what happens to those trees. So the argument they were making is about protecting the trees, but they were protecting the trees not just from some abstract development that was happening, they were also protecting those trees from the contractors who were coming from outside, from the contractors, from the governments and the people in power who were trying to decide what happens to those trees. So in that sense, it was clearly, the framing of the problem was fundamentally different between the women of Chipko who were hugging those trees and the environmentalists who were then seeing this as a broader environmental problem. In some senses, in the interim period itself, this was actually a productive, listening to each other's language was in fact productive. The forest did get protected. But if you look at it today, 20 years after, what you find is a strong alienation from those very forests. If you talk to the women today who were so strongly protecting those trees, one of the things they point out to you is the fact that the control over those resources has really not changed. The control over what happens to those trees still rests with the authorities in Delhi, or perhaps even broader international environmentalist groups, because finally, there is a blanket ban in that region on what happens to those trees. And in fact, we are looking at the fact that in fact there is an alienation now from those very forests that they were trying to protect. Okay, there are a couple of other things that I want to do, so I'll quickly run through them, and I won't go into the examples except when we come to discussion. There's a second point that I want to make that, in fact, is very, very common in discourses of this kind. That is the kind of dichotomy that is made between development and environmentalism. I want to fundamentally argue that environmentalism is as much about control over resources as development. The example that I just gave you already is an evidence of that. The fact that earlier when there was a central, a state-led movement to harvest the trees, and now when there is a state-led movement to protect the trees, in both cases, the control is actually non-local. It is the elite of India or perhaps the world who actually get to decide what happens to those resources. And in some sense, this dichotomy that is constantly played out, it is what is being opposed by a lot of activist movements at the local level. So I want to emphasize again that what people are arguing at the ground level when we're talking even about environmental movements is the fact that if you wanted, is the fact that it is the decision-making structures that are being challenged, rather than asking for more benign policies from the same decision-making structures. I will move quickly through the other kinds of arguments. The other example I have for this is, of course, the kind of international negotiations over climate change that are happening. If you notice, one of the main sticking points is really about whether you look at consumption in terms of countries and regions, or whether you should be looking at in terms of per capita. So, there's a lot of data that you can look at on these kinds of things. For instance, the per capita most polluting territories emit 1,000 times more carbon dioxide than the least polluting. So the kind of inequality we find in these kinds of things, in fact, prevent the take away from the possibility of actually coming to some kind of consensus on these kinds of things. The third kind of thing that I want to point out, again relating to this, is the fact that a lot of the instruments that we have around environmental conservation, dealing with climate change, actually draw from an earlier concept that, in fact, comes from the environmental justice movement in India. That's called the NIMBY concept, not in my backyard. So in some sense, the environmental movement used this to show how the costs of development in terms of toxic waste or pollution are actually things that are exported or moved to other sections of the population. I want to bring you back to the kind of solutions we have towards restricting carbon emissions and protecting biodiversity, creating parks and things like these. The conservation agenda also often tends to take the same kind of ideology. In some sense. So what the conservation agenda is trying to conserve is also things in distant places, rather than things in our own backyard. In fact, there's in fact a systematic contradiction that as a people or a region or a nation develop, resources for both development and for conservation actually come from spaces and people and times that are far removed. So it can be future generation, it can be other regions, it can be other sections of the population. The last kind of point that I want to make is that given that the perception of the problem itself is so diverse in an unequal world, the kind of solutions that we come up with are also not able to address it because we're looking at the problem itself very, very differently. In some sense, if you kind of look at the trading that happens over pollution, including CDMs and things like that, what we find is that these mechanisms are actually allowing the continuation. It's a permit for pollution. If we actually start looking, bringing in equity as one of the issues, equity in terms of resources in general, both for development and for conservation, what we're looking at is the fact that in a more equal world, we would actually have to pollute less. It is not about really transferring pollution from one region or one section of the population to the other. So in fact, in an equal world, what we will have is a much greater challenge because you will not have any section of the poor willing to accept the kind of byproducts of the kind of development we have. So I'm actually arguing that this is kind of going to be a game changer where we cannot continue to talk about the size of the cake or its redistribution. Those are very, very important concepts and discussions that we have been arguing, but that we have been having. But what I'm arguing is really that we have to start thinking about who decides how large that cake is going to be. And finally, we're talking about changing decision-making structures rather than changing policies within the same decision-making structures. I think a few of the earlier speakers, particularly Francisco, has sort of referred to that in terms of talking about, there is a question of what we talk about in terms of who heads the World Bank. So what the movements, the social movements, at least at the ground level, are asking are not simply that we have the same kind of directors, the same kind of managers, and they make more appropriate, more benign policies. But the demand from a lot of the social movements is fundamentally different. It's that the decision-making structures in terms of who decides actually has to fundamentally change. I'm going to leave you with that, with a lot to think about. Thank you.